The day Viola Hart met Lawrence did not feel like a turning point. There was no dramatic shift in the atmosphere, no sudden flash of intuition warning her that her existence was about to split cleanly into a before and an after. It was simply one of those heavy, exhausting Tuesday afternoons in Lagos, when the humidity clings to your skin and the relentless pressure of a corporate career settles deep into your bones, leaving you craving nothing but a moment of absolute silence where nobody expects anything from you. Viola, a brilliant and fiercely independent senior financial analyst who had spent her entire 20s clawing her way up the ruthless corporate ladder of Nigeria's economic hub, had escaped into a quiet, softly lit cafe in Victoria Island purely to hide from the world. The interior was cool, a sanctuary of air-conditioned calm detached from the chaotic roar of the traffic outside. A faint jazz playlist floated lazily through hidden speakers, blending seamlessly with the rich, comforting aroma of freshly ground coffee beans and the occasional, therapeutic clink of ceramic cups against saucers. Outside the large tinted glass windows, the harsh afternoon sunlight beat down mercilessly against the concrete high-rises. But inside, time seemed to stand completely still. It felt safe, it felt unhurried. Viola chose a secluded table near the back corner, slipped her aching feet out of her designer heels beneath the table, and allowed herself a rare, unmonitored pause. Her phone lay face down on the polished wood beside her, completely untouched. For once, she wasn't responding to urgent work emails, reviewing complex quarterly reports, or managing the endless demands of her high-powered life. She simply watched the thin wisps of steam rise from her cappuccino, letting her mind empty out, basking in the luxury of being entirely alone. She had only intended to stay long enough to finish that single cup, desperate to recharge her social battery before heading back to her quiet apartment. But she had barely taken 2 sips of her coffee when a shadow fell across her table, breaking the perfect solitude. Viola looked up, slightly annoyed by the intrusion, only to find a man standing before her who carried himself with a rare, quiet confidence. He wasn't dressed flashily, nor did he project the loud, aggressive arrogance so common among the wealthy elite of Lagos, but his tailored suit and the expensive watch glinting on his wrist spoke of unspoken privilege and hidden wealth. He had a warm, disarming smile and calm, perceptive eyes that suggested he was a man thoroughly accustomed to conversations going exactly his way. He looked down at her politely, raising his hands in a gentle gesture of apology. He told her he hoped he wasn't interrupting, but from across the room he had noticed her check her phone 3 times and sigh heavily each time, a universal sign that someone was having an exceptionally stressful day. Viola blinked, caught entirely off guard by his directness and his unsolicited observation. She asked him, with a hint of skepticism in her voice, if he routinely analyzed strangers from across a crowded room. He smiled softly, pulling back a chair with effortless charm, attributing it to occupational observation. Viola almost told him she preferred to be alone. Her natural instinct, honed by years of dealing with opportunistic people, was to guard her peace fiercely, yet there was something undeniably grounded and comforting about his presence. Instead of dismissing him, she found herself gesturing toward the empty chair, granting him exactly 2 minutes of her time. He sat down, extending a hand, and introduced himself as Lawrence. When Viola gave her name and shook his hand, the contact was brief and professional, yet it carried an odd, inexplicable sense of familiarity that sent a quiet shiver through her. What surprised Viola most in the minutes that followed wasn't the fact that a handsome, wealthy man had approached her in a cafe, but rather how completely effortless it became to talk to him. The conversation didn't feel like the typical, exhausting dance of superficial pleasantries. Within moments, they shifted from laughing about the maddening horrors of Lagos traffic to sharing deeply personal work frustrations, childhood memories of growing up in different parts of the country, their favorite comfort foods, and long-buried ambitions that neither of them usually shared with anyone, let alone a complete stranger. Time seemed to warp around them. The 2 minutes she had grudgingly granted him stretched into nearly an hour before Viola suddenly realized how low the sun had dipped outside the window. She was a woman who prided herself on her emotional walls, rarely opening up to anyone easily. Yet with Lawrence, every word flowed like water. There was no forced charm, no hidden agenda that she could detect, just a profound magnetic connection. When she finally stood up to leave, citing a late evening review she couldn't miss, he asked for her phone number. He didn't do it boldly or hesitantly. He did it naturally, as though the next step in their lives had already been mutually agreed upon without a single word. She handed it to him, her heart beating with a strange, forgotten rhythm. That evening, as she unlocked the door to her apartment, Viola tried to rationalize the encounter, telling herself it was just a pleasant, fleeting interaction with a nice stranger and nothing more. But Lawrence was a man of calculated intention. He called her the very next afternoon, his voice a welcome distraction from her chaotic schedule, and he called the day after that. What followed was a whirlwind of consistent, overwhelming attention that Viola had never experienced before. There were sweet good morning texts that arrived precisely before her morning alarm, random check-ins during her lunch breaks just to ensure she was eating, and unexpected deliveries of her favorite takeaway meals, arriving at her office desk on the late nights he knew she was working. Lawrence remembered every single microscopic detail she mentioned in passing. He knew exactly how she preferred her coffee, which corporate meetings stressed her out the most, and he even managed to find the obscure jazz song she had mentioned liking during their very first conversation. He was consistent, patient, and intensely intentional, slowly chipping away at the heavy armor she had worn for years. Viola found herself looking forward to his calls, her strict independence melting into a beautiful vulnerability. 3 weeks later, beneath a canopy of fairy lights at a secluded restaurant, when he officially asked her to be his girlfriend, she said yes without a single shred of hesitation. For the first time in her life, love felt incredibly simple, safe, and absolute. Or at the very least, that was the beautiful illusion he had masterfully constructed around her. As their relationship deepened over the following months, Lawrence began to speak more frequently about his inner circle of friends. He didn't speak of them casually. He spoke with a fierce, almost alarming loyalty that bordered on blind devotion. He explained to Viola that they were his true family, the people who had been with him through thick and thin, through poverty and success. He called them the Cyclates, a tightly knit brotherhood formed during their wild university days that had somehow survived into their successful adulthoods. According to Lawrence, there were 5 of them in total who had remained completely inseparable despite their separate careers, demanding relationships, and wildly different life paths. To Lawrence, their bond was sacred, unbreakable, and above reproach. Eventually, as their relationship hit the 6-month mark, Lawrence decided it was finally time for Viola to be initiated into his world and meet the legendary group. The dinner was arranged at an incredibly upscale, ultra-exclusive lounge in Lekki, a place where the wealthy elite gathered to flaunt their status. Viola arrived that evening feeling a familiar flutter of nervousness in her stomach, but she was deeply hopeful. She understood that meeting a partner's lifelong inner circle was a monumental milestone in her mind. Their acceptance often determined how peaceful and secure the future of the relationship would truly become. When they walked into the private dining area, Lawrence introduced them one by one, his face beaming with pride. There was George, a loud, boisterous man who immediately cracked a joke and filled the room with booming laughter. There was Kendrick, a quiet, sharp-eyed observer, who said very little but seemed to analyze everything with calculated precision. There was Marcus, who possessed an easy, effortless charm that made social interactions look like second nature. And then, sitting at the head of the table like an undisputed queen, there was Kate Donovan, the only woman in the tightly knit group. The moment Lawrence walked in, Kate stood up, completely bypassing Viola, and threw her arms around Lawrence in a tight, fiercely familiar embrace. Viola, standing just a step behind him, noticed that the hug lasted just a second or two too long to be considered casual between old friends. When Kate finally pulled away, she turned her gaze toward Viola, her lips curving into a brilliant smile, though her eyes remained entirely cold, sharp, and assessing. She remarked, with a voice dripping in false sweetness, that they had heard so much about the elusive Viola. As Lawrence proudly introduced Viola as his girlfriend, Kate studied her with a slow, agonizing thoroughness, scanning her from her designer shoes to the expression on her face, as if silently measuring her worth, her background, and her right to be in that room. Something about Kate's tone immediately unsettled Viola, planting a seed of deep discomfort that she couldn't shake off. Throughout the entire evening, Kate systematically dominated the environment, repeatedly referring to the men at the table as her boys, her brothers, her family, and the people she was fiercely biologically mandated to protect. To Viola's sharp intuition, each statement sounded less like an expression of sisterly affection and more like a loud, aggressive declaration of ownership over them, and over Lawrence in particular. Viola tried her absolute best to ignore the rising tension, smiling politely and trying to engage in the conversation. But as the multi-course dinner progressed, the microaggressions became impossible to miss. Kate touched Lawrence's arm frequently while speaking to him, leaning into his personal space with an ease that screamed intimacy. Whenever Viola and Lawrence became absorbed in their own, quiet conversation, Kate would abruptly interrupt with an inside joke from their university days, effectively shutting Viola out. She answered questions that were directly addressed to Lawrence, and at one point, she even corrected him mid-sentence regarding his own personal preferences, loudly proclaiming to the table that she knew him far better than anyone else in the world. Viola maintained her composure, smiling through the burning humiliation, refusing to show a single crack of insecurity. Yet a heavy, suffocating discomfort lingered in the air. On the quiet drive back to her apartment, the silence inside the luxury car became too heavy to bear, and Viola finally decided to speak up, gently asking Lawrence if Kate always behaved that way around new people. Lawrence glanced at her briefly, letting out a casual, dismissive laugh as he negotiated the Lagos traffic. He told her that it was just typical Kate behavior, explaining that she was simply very involved and fiercely protective of the group, because they had been friends forever. Viola hesitated, the weight of the evening pressing down on her chest, and softly confessed that she felt like Kate didn't like her at all. Lawrence immediately reached over, taking her hand in a warm, reassuring squeeze, telling her she was completely overthinking the situation, and that Kate behaved that way with everyone until she got to know them. He sounded incredibly sincere, his voice filled with that same grounding warmth that had won her over in the cafe. Viola, desperately wanting peace and stability more than she wanted to harbor dark suspicions, forced herself to believe him. She spent the next hour in bed convincing herself that she was just being overly sensitive, imagining monsters in the dark, and that she needed to give the friendships time to breathe. Over the following weeks, however, as Viola spent more time around the Cyclates at various high-end gatherings, barbecues, and exclusive parties, the chilling truth became completely impossible to ignore. The men in the group welcomed her with genuine warmth and respect, treating her as a permanent fixture in Lawrence's life, but Kate merely tolerated her presence like a mild, annoying inconvenience. The stark contrast between how the men treated her and how Kate behaved was deafening. Whenever Viola arrived at a gathering, the atmosphere would subtly but undeniably shift. Kate's loud, boisterous mood would instantly cool. Her witty jokes suddenly carried sharp hidden edges, aimed directly at Viola's career or background. Her smiles felt tightly rehearsed, vanishing the moment Viola looked away. Yet Lawrence never seemed to notice a single thing. Or perhaps, as a sickening thought occasionally crossed Viola's mind, he actively chose not to see it to avoid upsetting the delicate balance of his sacred friend group. Viola continuously told herself that adult relationships required immense adjustment, that lifelong friend groups took substantial time to warm up to outsiders, and that true love required patience. So she adapted. She laughed when she was expected to laugh, she gracefully ignored the uncomfortable, biting comments, and she constantly reassured herself that Lawrence's fierce loyalty to his friends was simply concrete proof that he was an inherently good, dependable man who deeply valued long-term relationships. What Viola completely failed to realize, blinded by her desire for a happy future, was that loyalty without strict, unyielding boundaries is not a virtue, it is a ticking time bomb. It is a dangerous, toxic flaw that can completely obliterate everything in its path. Because somewhere deep within that tightly bonded elite circle of friends, a dark, venomous resentment was already quietly growing, completely undetected. Kate watched every single interaction between the couple with eyes full of cold, calculating malice. She noted every shared laugh, every quiet, affectionate glance, and every single moment that shifted Lawrence's undivided attention, his time, and his immense wealth away from the group and toward his building relationship with Viola. Viola had unknowingly stepped into a psychological space that someone else firmly believed already belonged to them by right of history. That night, as Lawrence dropped Viola off at her apartment building, he kissed her forehead with an overwhelming, tender gentleness, whispering how incredibly happy he was that she was a part of his life. Viola smiled, believing his words completely, a sense of profound security washing over her. But as she walked up to her apartment and drifted into a peaceful sleep, She remained entirely unaware that her love had placed her directly in the center of a silent, vicious battlefield she didn't even know existed. Outside, Lawrence's luxury car melted into the chaotic Lazos night traffic, while across the city a dark room lit up with a single message notification on Kate's phone. Her fingers moved with lethal speed across the glass screen, typing a short, ominous sentence to an undisclosed recipient that read, "She is getting entirely too comfortable." Viola slept on, completely oblivious to the fact that the man she trusted with her entire heart would very soon become the exact reason why her entire world would begin to violently fall apart, leading toward a brutal trial of loyalty that would change her destiny forever. The first concrete sign that something was deeply wrong came long before the clinical automated announcement echoed through the crowded international terminal. Viola noticed it in the subtle, sharp shift of the morning air, specifically in the calculated way Kate completely avoided eye contact from the moment they all met near the departure wing. The entire group had agreed weeks prior to travel together for an exclusive, highly anticipated vacation to the Bahamas, a trip that Lawrence had enthusiastically insisted Viola join. Suitcases rolled smoothly across the polished marble floors, affluent laughter bounced between the soaring glass walls, and the Cyclates moved through the airport with the relaxed, elite confidence of people thoroughly accustomed to traveling the world as a seamless, untouchable unit. No. Lawrence held Viola's hand tightly as they walked toward the premium check-in counters, occasionally squeezing her fingers with a warm, reassuring pressure, a silent reminder that he was proud to have her by his side. For Viola, this trip meant infinitely more than a simple tropical getaway. It represented a long-sought acceptance. For months, she had quietly exhausted herself trying to fit naturally into Lawrence's world, swallowing her pride to accommodate friendships that had existed long before she ever arrived in his life. No. This trip was supposed to be the definitive confirmation that she was no longer an outsider looking in. She truly believed she belonged. But illusions shatter quickly under the weight of orchestrated malice. George spotted them first near the premium lounge entrance, waving his hands boisterously and shouting that they thought the couple had changed their minds. Kendrick let out a dry laugh while Marcus casually collected everyone's passports and digital booking confirmations to hand over to the airline attendant. Kate stood slightly apart from the men, her eyes glued to her phone, her fingers moving rhythmically. She looked up briefly as Viola approached, offering a tight, hollow smile that vanished from her face almost instantly, replaced by a cold, vacant mask. When Viola greeted her warmly, Kate merely offered a clipped, monosyllabic nod before returning her attention to her screen. It was nothing openly hostile, nothing that would cause Lawrence to notice, just the precise amount of icy politeness required to pass undetected by the men. The group moved toward the business-class airline counter together, chatting casually about their itinerary, while Marcus handed the stack of passports to the uniformed attendant. One by one, the heavy machines behind the counter began to hum, printing out the premium boarding passes. The attendant read the names aloud as she checked them off her system. George, Kendrick, Marcus, Kate, Lawrence. Then the hum stopped. The attendant paused, her fingers hovering tensely over the mechanical keyboard as a deep, professional frown formed on her face while she stared at the glowing monitor. The woman cleared her throat uncomfortably, looking up at the affluent group with a polite but apologetic expression, stating that she was deeply sorry, but she did not see any other passenger listed under this group booking reference. Viola blinked, a sudden prickle of unease hitting the back of her neck, and asked what she meant by another passenger. Marcus leaned forward over the high counter, his tone tinged with corporate impatience, telling the woman to check the database again because Viola was explicitly traveling with them. The attendant scanned the system once more, her eyes tracing the lines of code before she shook her head firmly, confirming that there were only exactly 5 passengers confirmed and ticketed on the booking. A strange, suffocating silence instantly settled over the entire group, replacing the lively chatter of a moment before. Lawrence frowned deeply, his posture stiffening as he stepped forward, declaring that it was entirely impossible. Slowly, inevitably, every single eye in the group turned toward Kate. It was Kate who had personally volunteered to handle their extensive travel arrangements, as she always did every single year to ensure they retained their exclusive group discounts and villa placements. Kate looked genuinely shocked, her eyes widening in a performance of utter disbelief, as she lightly covered her mouth with a manicured hand gasping that it couldn't be true. She lamented that she must have mistakenly booked only for the usual 5. The words cut through Viola like a physical blade. The usual 5. It was a phrase that deliberately and violently stripped her of her status, reducing her to an invisible entity. Kate let out a heavy apologetic sigh, explaining to the group that because they had always traveled as a strict unit of 5 people for nearly a decade, her memory had simply slipped into old habits. She claimed she didn't realize the omission, adding with a venomous subtlety that she had thought Lawrence had officially mentioned adding someone to the itinerary, but never received the explicit details. Someone, not Viola, the woman he had asked to marry him, but a nameless, disposable placeholder. George exhaled loudly and impatiently, checking his luxury watch and asking what was supposed to happen now, emphasizing that they couldn't possibly miss their premium international flight. Kendrick chimed in, noting that boarding was scheduled to begin in less than 20 minutes, adding pressure to the air. Lawrence turned immediately to Viola, his expression a mix of panic and defensiveness, promising her that they would fix the issue right then and there, demanding that the airline attendant simply book an additional seat next to them. But the attendant shook her head gently, her voice delivering a crushing finality, as she informed them that the flight was entirely fully booked in all cabins. The harsh words landed with a sickening weight. Viola stood entirely still, frozen in place, processing the raw humiliation of the moment while the frantic conversations continued to swirl around her as if she were a ghost, no longer truly present in their reality. Kate stepped closer, her expression a masterclass in performative guilt, whispering how incredibly sorry she was and insisting that it had honestly just slipped her mind during her busy work week. But as Viola looked directly into Kate's eyes, she noticed something deeply unsettling that made her blood run cold. Kate didn't look embarrassed or truly remorseful at all. Beneath the practiced downturn of her lips, her eyes looked completely relieved, shining with a dark, triumphant satisfaction. Marcus muttered an oath under his breath, grumbling that they had planned this specific vacation months ago, while George added, with clear frustration creeping into his voice, that the entire group couldn't possibly cancel an international trip because of a simple administrative booking mistake. The brutal implication hung heavily in the air, thick and suffocating. Viola suddenly understood the absolute gravity of the situation. This moment wasn't about logistics, or seat availability, or a forgotten name on a spreadsheet. It was about inconvenience. And in the eyes of Lawrence's sacred, lifelong friends, she had become a massive, unwelcome inconvenience that was actively ruining their perfect, elite dynamic. Lawrence looked completely torn, his gaze darting rapidly between the rigid faces of his childhood friends and the calm, pale face of his partner. The silence stretched, becoming an agonizing test of his true character. Finally, looking at Viola with an expression of immense guilt, he whispered that if she wanted him to, he wouldn't go on the trip. The statement should have comforted her, should have shown her that he valued her above all else. Instead, the hollow offer only made the situation infinitely worse. The moment the words left his mouth, every single eye in the tight-knit circle shifted toward Viola instantly. Their gazes were heavy, judgmental, and deeply hostile. Kate suddenly folded her arms across her chest, her posture radiating a silent, intense pressure. Nobody spoke a word, yet the unwritten message crashing against Viola was completely unmistakable. Don't you dare ruin this for him. Don't be the difficult, insecure girlfriend who separates a good man from his lifelong family. Don't make a scene. Viola felt a burning, quiet humiliation tear through her chest, but she refused to give Kate the satisfaction of seeing her cry or break down in public. Forcing a calm, measured smile onto her face, Viola spoke with absolute dignity, telling Lawrence that it was perfectly fine and that he should go enjoy the trip with his friends. Lawrence hesitated, asking if she was entirely sure, his voice carrying a subtle trace of relief that made Viola's heart ache with a profound sense of betrayal. Before Viola could even respond, Kate quickly jumped into the conversation, her voice bright and cheerful as she promised that they would absolutely plan another, separate trip altogether very soon. Another plastic smile, another calculated social performance. Inside Viola, a quiet fire ignited beneath her rigid composure. She stood by silently as Lawrence hugged her tightly, before heading toward the secure security clearance gate, whispering into her ear that he loved her and would call her the exact moment the aircraft touched down. She simply nodded, her voice locked away. She stood entirely alone in the massive terminal, watching his tall figure walk away from her. She watched the group reform their perfect circle of five, walking shoulder to shoulder. She watched Marcus laugh at something George said, and she watched Kate turn her head back briefly, right before entering the restricted access zone, casting one final lingering look at Viola, a look of pure, unadulterated victory, before vanishing entirely from sight. The exact moment Lawrence's plane took off into the sky, Viola walked over to the airport lounge and sat down completely alone. The vibrant excitement she had carried into the terminal that morning had drained out entirely, leaving behind a cold, piercing clarity she hadn't expected. It wasn't the fact that Kate had intentionally forgotten her ticket that hurt the most. It was how seamlessly and easily everyone, including the man who swore to protect her heart, had adjusted to her abrupt absence. They hadn't fought for her. They hadn't stayed behind with her. They had simply chosen convenience, leaving her discarded at the gate like an unwanted piece of baggage. Suddenly, her phone buzzed violently in her palm. It was an international notification showing Lawrence was attempting to call her via the aircraft's roaming network. Viola stared at the glowing screen for a long, agonizing minute, watching his name flash against the glass. Then, with a steady, unhurried finger, she opened his contact profile and pressed block. It wasn't an act born out of wild, uncontrolled anger. It was a decision rooted in absolute, unyielding self-respect. She refused to be an afterthought in a life she was supposed to be building as a priority. Thousands of feet above the Atlantic Ocean, sealed inside the business-class cabin, Lawrence kept anxiously checking his luxury phone. No response. His text messages remained stubbornly undelivered, and every single call he attempted to place failed immediately. At first he tried to comfort his mounting anxiety by assuming it was merely poor network coverage or an issue with the airport's standard tower transitions. But as the hours dragged on and the aircraft flew deeper into international airspace, a heavy, suffocating unease settled deep into his chest. By the time the massive aircraft finally landed and taxied down the runway, a cold realization struck him like a physical blow. Viola wasn't merely having a stressful day or dealing with a dead battery. She felt completely abandoned by him. She had seen right through the superficial polite veneer of the situation. The tropical vacation, the luxury villa, and the celebratory drinks his friends were already planning suddenly felt entirely hollow and meaningless to him, while George, Kendrick, Marcus, and Kate laughed and shouted, finalizing their arrival plans with the local transport drivers. Lawrence stood apart, his heart hammering against his ribs as he booked the earliest available premium return flight straight back to Lagos. The reaction from his lifelong inner circle was immediate and intensely hostile. George openly called him incredibly dramatic, scoffing at his anxiety, while Kendrick told him to just relax and give her space. Kate stepped in front of him, her voice dripping with artificial reason as she insisted that Viola was just throwing a tantrum and would inevitably calm down once she had a few days to think about it. But for the very first time since he had known them, Lawrence no longer felt comfortable or safe staying in their presence. The wool had not been fully pulled from his eyes, but a tear had formed in the fabric. He looked at his friends, and for the first time in his life, he genuinely questioned whether his blind, unyielding loyalty to their group had just cost him the most important, authentic relationship he had ever built. Turning his back on their protests and Kate's sharp, narrowing eyes, Lawrence boarded a return flight, leaving his friends behind in paradise. Viola absolutely did not expect him to return to the country so quickly. When her apartment doorbell rang late that night, cutting through the heavy silence of her living room, she opened it to find Lawrence standing on the threshold. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his hair was disheveled, and pure, unadulterated exhaustion was written across every line of his face. Viola looked at him, her expression an unreadable mask of cold composure, asking him simply if he had come back. Lawrence didn't offer a single excuse. He didn't try to defend Kate's mistake, nor did he try to blame the airline system. He looked at her with eyes full of deep, authentic regret, stating immediately that he never should have boarded that plane in the first place. He apologized repeatedly, his voice cracking with emotion as he condemned his own cowardice for not insisting she travel with him, for allowing her to be subjected to that humiliation, and for choosing his own comfort and convenience over her very real feelings. Viola stood by the door, listening quietly to his pleas, letting the silence stretch between them before she finally spoke the words that would redefine their entire relationship. She told him calmly that she had absolutely no inherent problem with his friends. but she would never, under any circumstances, compete with them for his basic respect. That single, unyielding sentence changed the entire trajectory of their lives. Viola explained calmly, logically, and without a single tear, how Kate's toxic behavior had made her profoundly uncomfortable from the very beginning of their relationship, pointing out the subtle, venomous patterns that Lawrence had willfully blinded himself to for months. For the very first time since they had met, Lawrence didn't try to brush it off as overthinking. He truly listened, not to formulate a defensive response, but to fundamentally understand the pain he had inflicted. He looked at her, entirely vulnerable, and asked what she wanted him to do. Viola met his eyes with absolute certainty, telling him he needed to set strict, unbreakable boundaries. Nothing dramatic, nothing controlling, just basic, non-negotiable respect for her position in his life. Lawrence agreed without a single second of hesitation, vowing to protect her from that day forward. And to her surprise, he kept his word. In the months that followed, the dynamic within the Sicklates changed drastically. Lawrence enforced a strict distance, and Kate's overbearing behavior was forced to grind to a halt. The group remained present, but a cold, permanent boundary had been drawn. Peace returned, their love deepened, and exactly 1 year after the incident at the airport, Lawrence stood before their families, sliding a diamond wedding ring onto Viola's finger. The memory of the airport faded into a distant shadow, a crisis they survived. But neither of them realized that the incident hadn't been the end of the war. It was merely the moment invisible lines were drawn in the sand, lines that would one day determine who truly belonged in their home, who never intended to let Viola stay alive in his heart. They say marriage changes people, but Viola didn't notice the insidious shift immediately. At first, stepping into marriage felt like finding refuge in warm sunlight after enduring years of emotional uncertainty. Everything softened beautifully. Their conversations lasted late into the night, their laughter came easier, and even the comfortable silences shared between her and Lawrence felt incredibly safe, the rare kind of silence that didn't demand explanations or justifications. For the first time in her adult life, Viola completely stopped preparing herself for inevitable disappointment. She finally let her guard down, allowing true happiness to blossom naturally. Their marital home slowly transformed into a space that felt genuinely lived in rather than merely aesthetically impressive. Lawrence's carefully curated, rigid bachelor aesthetics gradually disappeared beneath framed wedding photos, aromatic scented candles that Viola loved, and half-finished mugs of herbal tea abandoned during their long, intimate conversations. They happily learned each other's hidden daily rhythms. Lawrence discovered that Viola hummed unconsciously whenever she was intensely focused on her laptop. Viola learned that Lawrence absolutely detested sleeping without some form of gentle background noise. They argued occasionally, of course, about clashing schedules, grueling work hours, or whose turn it was to call extended family, but the disagreements never lasted long enough to leave a lasting wound. When Viola discovered she was pregnant, Lawrence stared at the positive test strip for nearly 5 minutes in absolute silence before he let out a soft, breathless laugh, a beautiful mixture of disbelief turning into pure, unadulterated joy. That very night, he rested his head gently against her flat stomach, as if their unborn child could already hear his voice, promising to protect both of them with his life. Viola believed him completely. However, the raw reality of labor stripped Viola of all elegance, composure, and pride, reducing life to a primal struggle of breathing and sheer endurance. Hours blurred into one endless, agonizing battle until a sharp, alive, and demanding cry suddenly broke through the sterile room, announcing a new existence. Everything stopped. The nurse gently placed the wet, tiny baby against Viola's bare chest, and those microscopic fingers curled instinctively around her thumb. Feeling that incredible warmth, fragility, and pure life, Viola cried harder than she ever had during the labor itself. Lawrence stood directly beside the hospital bed, completely stunned into a reverent silence, his large hands trembling violently as he reached out to touch the baby's soft cheek, whispering that she was finally real. They named her Light, because that was exactly what she felt like, a brilliant beam piercing through their world. Motherhood rearranged Viola's priorities overnight. Her corporate achievements suddenly felt distant and meaningless compared to the miracle sleeping peacefully beside her each night. High-stakes meetings became shorter, and strict deadlines mattered infinitely less, because every single gummy smile from Light felt like an award no corporate boardroom could ever offer. Exhaustion lived permanently like dark shadows beneath Viola's eyes, yet a profound happiness replaced her intense career ambition as her primary driving force. Late nights became sacred, quiet rituals where rocking chairs creaked softly, soothing lullabies replaced work emails, and tiny rhythmic breaths filled the quiet darkness. Lawrence changed dramatically too. He rushed home from the office significantly earlier, canceled important business meetings without a single complaint, quickly learned how to sterilize bottles, and carried the baby with a surprising, protective gentleness. Sometimes Viola would catch him just staring at Light for long stretches of time, as though trying to permanently memorize her fragile existence. And those beautiful moments deeply reassured her that they were becoming an unshakable family. But that hard-won peace was violently shattered when the Sicklates arrived at their home without much warning. Their overwhelming presence, filling the quiet spaces far too quickly with loud greetings, confident laughter, and a suffocating familiarity that aggressively demanded attention. Viola welcomed them with practiced, polite diplomacy, having learned long ago that social grace was far easier than open resistance. Light lay comfortably in her play cradle in the living room, completely fascinated by the rapid movement of the unfamiliar faces surrounding her. Kate approached the cradle first. Her polished smile carried a veneer of warmth, but something about her posture felt intensely observational and clinical rather than genuinely affectionate, as though she were analyzing a foreign subject under a microscope instead of greeting an innocent child. Bending closer to the baby, Kate remarked softly that she was beautiful, allowing Viola to relax her shoulders slightly. But then, Kate tilted her head with a calculated pause, a silence that stretched out just long enough to heavily shift the atmosphere in the room, before loudly pointing out that the baby didn't really look like Lawrence at all. The entire room instantly shifted. It was a subtle, almost invisible strike, but something fragile and vital cracked open beneath the surface. Lawrence reacted with immediate, uncharacteristic fury, cutting through the air sharply to tell her that was enough. Nobody laughed. Nobody added to the toxic comment, and Kate quickly lifted her hands defensively, claiming she was only making a casual observation. But Lawrence doubled down with an intense firmness that surprised everyone in the room, including Viola, moving directly toward the cradle and lifting Light carefully into his arms, as if physically shielding her from an invisible poisonous harm, fiercely declaring that no one would ever talk about his daughter like that again. The conversation died instantly. Someone rapidly changed the subject, and social voices resumed. But an irreversible damage had already been done to the psychological fabric of their home. Viola forced herself to smile through the remainder of the visit, serving drinks, responding politely when spoken to, and nodding at jokes she barely heard. Yet Kate's venomous words replayed endlessly in a terrifying loop inside her mind. Not because she doubted her own absolute loyalty, but because she noticed a chilling detail. Lawrence had suddenly become incredibly quiet, and though he participated in the conversations, his gaze drifted repeatedly toward Light, lingering longer than usual, with a dark, heavy expression of intense observation, measurement, and deep thought. Doubt does not arrive loudly as an obvious betrayal. It arrives quietly, masterfully disguised as harmless curiosity. Lawrence hated himself for even remembering Kate's careless comment, knowing he trusted Viola completely. Yet the human mind is uniquely built to betray certainty. Late at night, he found himself unconsciously tracing similarities in Light's features, her eyes, her smile, the curve of her nose, struggling on certain days to see his own reflection in his daughter, a frustrating uncertainty that filled him with immense guilt. He tried to bury it deep down, loving his family harder and pretending nothing had changed, but the doubt behaved exactly like water leaking through microscopic cracks, quietly spreading through his mind. The dark spiral intensified when a specific relationship podcast appeared during a late-night scroll while Viola slept peacefully beside him. The host spoke in a calm, analytical tone, detailing heartbreaking stories of successful men who had unknowingly raised children that were not biologically theirs. He almost skipped it, but then the echo of Kate's voice rushed back into his mind, accompanied by the memory of Marcus's low laugh and George's heavy silence from that fateful evening. The episode played long into the night as Lawrence stared blankly at the ceiling, feeling an invisible toxic shift taking root inside his own home. Within days, listening to the podcast became a hidden obsessive routine during his morning drives and late evenings in his study, whenever Viola stepped away. Each horror story sounded painfully identical, detailing trust, love, absolute shock, and the ultimate public humiliation of men becoming the laughingstocks of their social circles. Unable to quiet his roaring thoughts, Lawrence eventually opened the podcast's anonymous online discussion forum, staring at hundreds of confessions from strangers hidden behind usernames. With trembling fingers, he began to type, telling himself it was entirely harmless. He wrote anonymously about loving his wife deeply, about never wanting to insult her or permanently damage their beautiful marriage, but explained that his lifelong friends kept constantly planting dark doubts about his daughter's paternity. He explicitly stated that he wanted to avoid a catastrophic confrontation and merely wanted total peace of mind. When he pressed submit, a wave of relief washed over him, convincing himself that would be the absolute end of the matter. It wasn't. Within hours, a flood of ruthless notifications filled his thread, with comment after comment delivering the exact same cold, practical advice. Don't ask your wife. Just get a DNA test quietly by taking a strand of the child's hair or saliva secretly, because if the baby is yours, no harm is done, but you must protect yourself from raising another man's child. The vicious suggestion repeated itself so often in his head that it stopped sounding extreme. It began to sound practical, safe, and logical. That very same afternoon, completely unaware of the dark storm building in her husband's mind, Viola sat in her corporate office during a brief break. A colleague had shared a trending link in their workplace group chat, the exact same relationship podcast that was gaining massive attention online. Out of pure boredom, Viola opened the link, casually scrolling through the anonymous confessions until one specific post caught her eye. It was a man describing agonizing uncertainty about his child's paternity, mentioning how much he loved his wife, but explaining that his close friends were constantly planting doubts in his mind. Viola paused, a strange flash of discomfort brushing against her thoughts, because the raw emotion behind the words felt hauntingly familiar. But she quickly shook it off, telling herself that millions of marriages faced identical hurdles, and that her husband was far too secure, loving, and loyal to ever humiliate her by discussing their sacred marriage publicly, even anonymously. Closing the thread, she returned to work, firmly believing that true trust meant refusing to imagine a betrayal where none existed. That evening at home, Lawrence behaved with a terrifying normalcy. Viola watched from the hallway as he sat in the living room with light on his lap, feeding her mashed fruit and speaking to her in soft, playful tones that filled the house with apparent warmth. Yet, Viola's mind refused to rest, because earlier that afternoon, curiosity had drawn her back to read the deeper comments beneath that anonymous post, and she had seen the specific advice telling the husband to steal a strand of the child's hair to run a hidden test. Standing outside the room, a sudden sickening thought crossed her mind, but she angrily scolded herself for being intensely paranoid. She took 3 steps into the living room, but the exact moment she entered, she froze in sheer horror. Lawrence suddenly leaned closer over light, his fingers moving with a swift, calculated tug toward the baby's head, a movement so fast it was meant to look entirely accidental. Viola's heart dropped violently into her stomach. Shouting his name, her voice tearing through the room in absolute panic, she rushed forward instantly and scooped Light protectively into her arms, holding the child tightly against her chest, as she demanded to know why he was pulling their baby's hair. Lawrence froze for a split second, a look of pure, unadulterated guilt flashing across his eyes before he masterfully recovered, replacing it with a mask of absolute confusion. Raising his hand calmly, he showed her a tiny insect trapped between his fingers, explaining smoothly that a bug had fallen into the baby's hair, and he was simply trying to remove it before it bit her. Viola stared at the weak insect, her breathing slowing down as a wave of intense embarrassment and shame washed over her. She felt absolutely ridiculous, weeping softly as she apologized profusely to him, utterly disgusted with herself for letting internet paranoia convince her, even for a second, that her loving husband could ever secretly betray her or doubt their innocent child. Lawrence smiled with an overwhelming, reassuring sweetness, brushing it off easily as hyper-protective motherhood, and told her it was completely fine. Viola carried the sleeping baby to the nursery, her heart heavy with immense self-reproach, vowing to plan a special intimate dinner for the two of them that very night to properly apologize and completely reset the trust in their marriage. Meanwhile, The exact moment her footsteps faded down the hallway, Lawrence let out a heavy, ragged exhale, his shoulders dropping in immense relief as he opened his tightly clenched palm. Hidden safely beneath his fingers was the true prize he had successfully managed to keep completely unnoticed, a long, intact strand of Light's hair. A faint, dark smile of triumph crept onto his face as he congratulated himself on escaping her suspicion, entirely unaware that the crack of distrust had already been permanently opened, and the invisible countdown to the absolute destruction of his life had officially begun. The steam from the shower had finally washed away the physical tension in Viola's chest, but it could not quiet the lingering microscopic voice of intuition that screamed something was deeply altered in her home. Dressed in her elegant emerald dress, she walked into the walk-in closet to find a matching belt, her mind still heavy with guilt over how she had unjustly accused Lawrence earlier. But as her hand reached into the far corner of the wardrobe, her fingers brushed against a cold, unfamiliar object hidden beneath a stack of folded winter sweaters. It was a smartphone, a sleek, expensive device she had never seen before in her life. A heavy, terrifying dread instantly settled into her stomach as she picked it up. The phone wasn't locked with a complex password. It opened with a simple swipe, and the reality that spilled across the screen instantly shattered her soul into a million unfixable pieces. The chat threads were an endless, stomach-churning labyrinth of absolute betrayal. There were hundreds of messages from Kate Donovan, filled with explicit photographs, highly intimate declarations of love, and detailed logistics of a secret, passionate affair that had been occurring right under Viola's nose for years. But the horror went infinitely deeper. Viola clicked on a pinned group chat titled The Sicklates, and there, laid out in cold, unyielding digital ink, was the true, monstrous face of the people she had tried so hard to please. Marcus, George, Kendrick, and Lawrence were all actively participating in a continuous, malicious mockery of her life. They called her pathetic names, laughed at her career ambitions, and masterfully coordinated secret jokes at her expense. Lawrence just a passive observer to their cruelty. He was an active participant, mocking the very life, home, and family they had built together. Then, with a shaking finger, Viola opened the browser history and saw the open tabs. It was the exact anonymous relationship podcast forum she had read at her desk. The user profile belonged to Lawrence, the anonymous man who had publicly humiliated her by questioning their daughter's paternity, the man who had secretly pulled Light's hair just hours prior to run a hidden DNA test, was her own husband. Worse still, the banking application revealed massive, unauthorized financial transfers directly from their joint savings account straight to Kate's personal bank details, funding her luxury Lecky apartment rent, her designer clothes, and her lavish lifestyle under the false guise of lifelong generosity. Viola sank onto the edge of the bed, the hidden phone clutched in her trembling hands as silent, burning tears of pure devastation streaked down her face. Every single dynamic, every microaggression from Kate, and every whispered doubt she had bravely endured over the past year suddenly clicked into place with a terrifying absolute clarity. Her entire marriage had been a calculated, multi-layered lie. The door clicked open and Lawrence stepped into the bedroom, a casual smile on his face that instantly withered the moment he saw her holding the secret device. His face drained of all color as he stammered, asking what she was doing. Viola didn't cry out, she didn't scream. Instead, a cold, lethal composure washed over her as she stood up, holding the phone in the air. Her voice cutting through the room like shattered glass as she stated with absolute certainty that he was the anonymous man on the podcast, that he was funding Kate's lifestyle with her hard-earned money, and that his pathetic friends had been mocking her, while he happily joined in on the betrayal. Lawrence's mouth opened and closed in a pathetic display of panic, his mind scrambling for a defensive lie as he desperately claimed he could explain everything. But when he realized the evidence was absolute, his defensive mechanism instantly kicked in, and he aggressively tried to deflect the blame, loudly demanding to know why she had the right to go through his private things. Viola's voice rose, sharp, unyielding, and fierce, declaring that she absolutely did not need his permission to protect herself and her innocent child from a monster. Lawrence froze, entirely stunned, and caught completely off guard by the sheer power and absolute lack of fear in her eyes. Realizing that intimidation would achieve nothing, his voice dropped to a pathetic, trembling whisper, begging her to let them talk it out, pleading that they could fix it, and crying that he never meant for things to go this far. But Viola was already 1,000 miles away from him. Pointing a single, rigid finger toward the exit, she delivered a cold, final command: "Pack your bags and get out of my house." Lawrence's eyes widened in sheer disbelief as he protested, claiming she couldn't just throw him out of his own property. Viola stepped closer, her expression radiating a terrifying absolute authority, as she told him that if he did not pack his things and leave within 5 minutes, she would instantly forward every single screenshot, bank transfer, and explicit message to his conservative parents, her own family, his corporate colleagues, his investors, and every single prominent figure in Lagos society, ensuring his absolute, permanent social and professional humiliation. Ruined, and completely terrified of the consequences, Lawrence slowly reached for a duffel bag with trembling hands, throwing in a few random clothes, his wallet and his keys, before walking out into the dark Lagos night, completely broken. The very next morning, Viola sat stiffly in the high-end modern office of Mrs. Laura Steele, the most formidable and feared divorce lawyer in Nigeria. Mrs. Steele was a legend, a woman renowned across the country for her absolute hatred of marital infidelity, manipulation, and financial deceit. A legal shark who had successfully ruined powerful men and stripped unfaithful spouses of every asset they possessed. Mrs. Steele leaned back in her heavy leather chair, her sharp, analytical eyes scanning the thick, meticulously organized folder of evidence Viola had laid before her. A cold, approving smile formed on the lawyer's lips as she tapped a page of Kate's messages, remarking that the woman was exceptionally audacious, manipulating a weak man to ruin a marriage she had no stake in. Mrs. Steele looked directly into Viola's eyes, asking for full, unrestricted legal permission to dig incredibly deep into Lawrence's private finances, corporate communications, and hidden assets, warning her that the process would uncover absolute ugliness. Viola didn't blink. Her jaw tightened as she gave full permission, stating she wanted the absolute, unvarnished truth. 2 days later, while Viola was sitting in the quiet of her living room watching Light play peacefully with her toys, Mrs. Laura Steele called her back. The lawyer's voice was firm, carrying a shocking weight that made Viola instantly straighten in her seat. Mrs. Steele revealed that the situation was infinitely worse than they had initially imagined. Through deep financial forensic tracing, they had discovered that Kate Donovan wasn't just having a secret affair with Lawrence. She had also been sleeping with Marcus simultaneously. Marcus knew entirely about Kate's affair with Lawrence, but he actively chose to stay silent and participate in the mockery because Kate was using the massive amounts of money she manipulated out of Lawrence to fully fund Marcus's own lifestyle and business ventures. They had been playing Lawrence like a complete fool since before the wedding, using his deep-seated insecurity and his blind, unyielding loyalty to his friend group to systematically drain his wealth and destroy his family. A quiet, roaring fire ignited deep inside Viola's soul, replacing every shred of lingering sorrow with a cold, calculating rage. She asked the lawyer what their next move should be. Mrs. Steele replied that it depended entirely on her. She could walk away quietly, or she could make every single one of them pay a catastrophic price for their deceit. Viola paused, a dark, brilliant plan masterfully forming in her brilliant financial mind. She told the lawyer she wanted absolute justice. That very evening, Viola unblocked Lawrence and called him, her voice completely calm, smooth, and entirely casual. She told him that after thinking things over, she wanted to find a path toward peace, and she instructed him to invite the entire group of Sicklates over to their marital home the following evening for an elegant dinner, so they could completely reset the tension and move forward as a mature family. Lawrence's overwhelming relief was palpable through the phone line. He repeatedly thanked her, entirely convinced that his smooth charm had won her back, and that she was preparing to forgive him. He promised to coordinate everything immediately, entirely unaware that he was eagerly walking straight into his own public execution. The next evening, the atmosphere inside the dining room was flawless. Viola had hired a high-end private chef to prepare a multi-course gourmet meal. Soft jazz music played beautifully through the speakers, and the champagne flowed effortlessly. Viola wore her breathtaking deep red dress, looking like an undisputed queen of absolute power. When the doorbell rang, she opened it to find Lawrence standing there, a massive, arrogant smile of relief on his face, with the Sicklates trailing closely behind him. Kate arrived dressed in a lavish, expensive gala dress, oozing a supreme, smug confidence as she sweetly complimented Viola's appearance, entirely convinced her manipulation had succeeded perfectly. The dinner progressed with lively laughter, the group drinking heavily and celebrating Lawrence's apparent return to the household, while Viola sat at the head of the table, saying very little, quietly waiting for the main course to end. When the final plates were cleared, Viola stood up gracefully, her presence instantly commanding the room as she calmly announced that before dessert was served, she had prepared a special, unique gift for every single person at the table. On her signal, the private chef stepped forward, placing 5 identical, neatly bound, heavy manila folders directly in front of each guest. Confusion instantly rippled across the table. George opened his folder, Kendrick followed. Marcus froze halfway through lifting his, and Kate slowly opened hers with a mounting expression of dread. An absolute, suffocating silence violently swallowed the room as the pages revealed their contents. Laid out in meticulous, undeniable detail were high-resolution screenshots of the explicit messages, the exact bank transfers, the forensic proof of Kate's double affair with Marcus, the photographs, and every single transcript of them mocking Lawrence and Viola behind their backs. George slammed his folder shut, his face turning purple with rage as he screamed, demanding to know what the hell this was. Kendrick stared at Kate in utter, absolute disgust, his voice rising sharply as he asked if she was genuinely sleeping with both Lawrence and Marcus. All eyes violently pivoted toward Marcus, whose absolute, cowardly silence confirmed the sickening truth before he could even utter a word. Realizing she was completely trapped, Kate's face drained of all color, and she instantly burst into loud theatrical tears, her shoulders shaking violently as she desperately tried to manipulate the room into feeling sympathy for her. But nobody moved toward her. The performance failed catastrophically. Seeing that her tears were completely useless, Kate's face suddenly transformed into a mask of pure, unadulterated venom. She snapped her head up, laughing bitterly and coldly at the table, loudly declaring that yes, she knew exactly what she was doing. She looked directly at Lawrence, spitting out that he was an incredibly weak, spineless coward, a pathetic excuse of a man who couldn't even defend his own wife and daughter when they publicly questioned her child's paternity. Lawrence stared at her, his eyes wild with absolute shock and heartbreak, hoarsely asking if she had truly just preyed on his wealth. Kate shrugged carelessly, laughing in his face, telling him he made it incredibly easy because he lacked a basic spine, openly admitting that she had used both him and Marcus to finance her ambitions because they were incredibly useful fools. The dining room erupted into absolute chaos. Loud accusations flew across the table, chairs scraped violently against the floor, and George lunged verbally at Marcus in a fit of pure rage. Then a sharp, clear sound cut through the madness. Clink, clink. Viola tapped her silver spoon gently against her crystal champagne glass. The sound was small, but it instantly commanded absolute silence. Every single head turned toward her. Viola stood at the head of the table, entirely untouched by the toxic madness unfolding around her, her posture radiating an untouchable, majestic authority. Looking directly at her husband, she spoke in a calm, even voice that landed with the weight of a sledgehammer, stating that she didn't organize this dinner to argue. She simply wanted Lawrence to finally understand how incredibly foolish and broken he truly was. She told him he had willfully thrown away the one authentic person who would have loved him unconditionally for the rest of his life, all because toxic strangers and manipulative parasites had planted doubt in his weak mind. Lawrence's eyes filled with desperate flowing tears as he begged her for mercy, but Viola raised a single cold hand, shutting him down completely. Her voice hardened into pure steel as she delivered the final, devastating blow. From this exact moment onward, he would be stripped of everything. He would never be a permanent figure in Light's life. She refused to let her daughter grow up being raised by a coward who secretly doubted her very existence. She informed them calmly that Mrs. Laura Steele had already secured the freezing of their joint assets, the immediate forfeiture of the marital home due to his financial misconduct, and absolute custody of their child. Looking across the fractured, humiliated faces of the elite circle, Viola gestured coldly toward the exit, delivering her final iconic command. "Take your pathetic group of nitwits and get the hell out of my house." Kate stood up first, her face twisted in pure, burning fury, and stormed out of the house into the night, completely unmasked. George and Kendrick followed, casting looks of absolute disgust at Marcus and Lawrence, while Marcus slunk out like a defeated dog. Lawrence remained behind for a final agonizing moment, looking like a man who had suddenly realized far too late that in his desperate bid to please a toxic illusion of loyalty, he had completely destroyed every single authentic thing he had ever owned. He stepped toward her, crying, pleading for a second chance, but Viola simply turned her back on him. The heavy front door closed behind him with a definitive echoing thud, signaling the absolute triumphant victory of justice over a year of calculated cruelty. The swift, unyielding turning of the wheel of karma is rarely loud, but its finality is absolute. In the highly publicized court proceedings that gripped Lagos society weeks after that fateful dinner, Lawrence attempted a desperate, pathetic legal battle to contest the divorce and retain a portion of his wealth, but the meticulous forensic trap laid by Mrs. Laura Steele was completely inescapable. The overwhelming digital evidence of his gross financial misconduct, his multi-year infidelity, and his systematic draining of shared family funds to subsidize Kate's lavish lifestyle left the presiding judge completely devoid of sympathy. The court ruled aggressively and entirely in Viola's favor. Viola retained absolute custody of Light, the title to their massive luxury home, and the entirety of the frozen family assets, leaving Lawrence utterly stripped of his unearned pride and material comfort. The swift consequences of his betrayal did not halt at the courtroom doors. They bled rapidly into his professional life. When senior executives at his high-stakes corporate firm discovered how deeply their company's elite credibility had been tied to a viral financial scandal and immense personal irresponsibility, their trust evaporated overnight. Lawrence was summarily and ruthlessly dismissed from his executive position, his hard-won corporate reputation reduced to absolute ash. He was forced to move out of the affluent neighborhoods of Lekki, taking up residence in a cramped, depressing apartment on the outskirts of the city, surviving on erratic, low-paying consulting gigs that barely covered his basic expenses. His own traditional parents, crushed by the deep shame of how he had willfully destroyed an authentic marriage through blind arrogance and imported doubt, distanced themselves entirely from him, leaving him to sit alone in the dark, haunted by the echoing memory of the daughter whose very existence he had dared to question. For Kate Donovan, the fall from grace was even more devastatingly absolute. Once the unmasked truth of her dual exploitation of both Lawrence and Marcus became public knowledge across their high society circles, her carefully manufactured status as an elite influencer and socialite shattered instantly. The wealthy sponsors and high-end brands she relied on to maintain her superficial illusion of luxury canceled her contracts without a single second of hesitation, leaving her entirely broke. Exposed as a parasitic, manipulative predator who preyed on weak men to destroy innocent families, she became a toxic pariah in Lagos. Unable to look anyone in the eye or fund her exorbitant lifestyle, rumor had it that she packed her few remaining belongings in the dead of night and relocated entirely to a remote area in Ghana, starting over in complete obscurity. Forever hunting for another naive target, willing to finance her desperate, fading ambitions. The legendary untouchable brotherhood of the Cyclates dissolved completely into thin air, their decade-long bond fracturing beyond any hope of repair. George and Kendrick refused to ever speak to Marcus or Lawrence again, deeply disgusted by the raw depth of the deceit they had blindly harbored within their circle. There were no more elite vacations, no more loud, boisterous reunions, and no more shared laughter, only a heavy, permanent silence remained where a toxic illusion of loyalty had once forcefully demanded sacrifice. Months after the final papers were signed, Viola made the empowering, deliberate decision to sell the Lekki house. Refusing to let her daughter grow up in a space where invisible lines of resentment and hidden surveillance had once threatened their peace. Instead, she purchased a breathtaking, sprawling lakeside estate, tucked away in a quiet, highly secure sanctuary. It was an open, magnificent home, filled with soaring windows that let in an abundance of warm natural sunlight, a place completely rooted in certainty, safety, and truth. On quiet, serene evenings, Viola would sit on the polished wooden deck, a comforting cup of tea in her hands, watching little Light laugh freely as she chased the golden reflections of the setting sun across the calm water. She would occasionally look back at the naive, trusting woman she had been in that Victoria Island cafe years ago, a woman who had allowed a charming man to manipulate her boundaries under the guise of an effortless romance. She remembered the sheer, agonizing weight of the humiliation she suffered at the international terminal and the terrifying moment she realized her love was a weapon being used against her. But she also looked at the fierce, untouchable matriarch she had successfully become. recognizing that the brutal storm had not broken her, it had merely forged her into someone completely unbreakable. This dramatic, emotional journey leaves us with a profound, unshakable truth that every single one of us must carry into our own lives. True loyalty does not demand that you erase your boundaries. An authentic love will never ask you to compromise your self-respect to appease the toxic egos of an inner circle. When a man allows the careless whispered doubts of envious onlookers and internet strangers to poison the sanctity of his own home, he does not prove his analytical intelligence. He merely exposes his own profound weakness of character. Karma is a meticulous accountant. It does not forget a single lie, and it ensures that those who mistake your quiet kindness for vulnerability will eventually be forced to drown in the very chaos they masterfully orchestrated behind your back. Protect your peace fiercely, watch the company your partner keeps, and never, under any circumstances, allow a coward to define your worth or the legitimacy of your blessings. What do you think about Lawrence's devastating downfall and Viola's magnificent triumphant victory? Did the punishment truly fit the crimes of Kate and the Cichlets? Sound off with your raw thoughts and deep opinions in the comments section below. Make sure to hit that like button to support authentic justice, and subscribe to the channel right now to ensure you never miss another highly gripping, instructive story of karma, hidden wealth, and the ultimate triumph of a good heart over absolute deceit.